Today we enter a chamber in the Yewdeep where the dead do not rest. They comply. This is the Hall of Bearing.
The Hall of Bearing never smelled the same as the rest of the Yewdeep. The sap light was the same, the rootwork also, and the slow respiration of the place was the same. But here the air held something else. It was the scent of preservation, of something held beyond its hour and kept from making any further claim upon time. I'm Anwen, but was known for a time as the Sap Sister. This story is a moment. We were tended, we observed, and then one day everything changed and we were called. Wryke entered the hall and 2 Rootkin followed him through. Each carried a shallow bowl of clear, soft resin, a cloth of fibrous weave grown to absorb without shedding, and a narrow tool of pale bone with a rounded end that could press and smooth the amber's surface where small imperfections had formed. Light, Wryke said, and the sap lights along the inner curve of the hall brightened. The hall was long, its floor falling away so that the far end sank into a deeper basin. The walls were root-formed, but smoothed, and along either side the interred hung, suspended in amber. Each body was held in its own vertical chamber, grown into the rootwork. Some were close to the floor, some raised above head height, placed as the Yewdeep's changing architecture had permitted over time. The amber itself was not the same from one to the next. Some glowed with a clean honey light, while others were darker and more opaque. The Rootkin moved ahead of Wryke, and one knelt at the first cell and began to wipe the amber in slow, circular motions. The other held the bowl steady, dipping the fibrous weave and wringing it with a gentle twist that did not fling a single drop. Wryke walked the hall at a pace that showed he understood that haste would be sacrilege here. He never let his eyes settle on any one figure for too long, but he did pause at the first chamber because the surface was showing a faint clouding that came from minute fractures healing imperfectly. The Rootkin's cloth cleared most of it, but it then quickly returned. "Press," Wryke said. The Rootkin with the bone tool shifted position and set the rounded end against the amber, applying pressure gradually so that the clouding eased and the fracture lines smoothed into the surrounding glow. Wryke's eyes settled on the body behind the amber. The figure was slim, with sloped shoulders and a young face. The posture was one of acceptance, and the hands were held in front of the torso, folded on the chest. This was Fenner Lewin, the Sap Keeper. His name was recalled happily, because Fenner had been an easy interment. The sap had taken him cleanly. The hall had not strained, the roots had not needed to grow tighter, and nor had the amber thickened to make him hold. Fenner had yielded readily, and the yielding had been reflective of his entire tenure as far as Wryke could recall. He had been young enough to be frightened, old enough to hide it, and careful enough never to use his station as a weapon. Wryke remembered his voice only as a tone. It had been low, even, and bereft of malice. The Rootkin finished their work, and they moved deeper into the hall. The light grew warmer in the middle section because the amber was older and more saturated. Wryke's steps slowed again. The next cell held a man whose body appeared too heavy for the amber that bore it. He remained broad even in death. The amber around him was darker than usual, and when the Rootkin wiped it, the glow did not brighten. Wryke stood and did not speak for a moment, and the Rootkin paused, cloth pressed to the surface, waiting. "Careful here," Wryke said. The Rootkin took the warning as both instruction and permission, easing the cloth away. The amber bore faint striations, marks that were not cracks and not scratches. They were the sign of sap laid down in layers, poured repeatedly in different seasons, each pour an attempt to keep the body from doing something it insisted upon. For this host had been driven by the conflicting forces of inherited rights and the Yew's intention. Yew'n Yerint, the bound king. Wryke did not remember him as king. The Marchlands remembered him that way, with his sigil pressed into their gold and their stories, but the Hall had never cared for crown or claim. The Yewdeep had received Yew'n as a man in flight, lungs burning, mouth tasting of blood, and hands shaking from the weight of his loss. He had stumbled into the Yew and thought it a convenient hiding place. The Yew had accepted him and put him to use. King Yew'n had lasted longer than he ought to have done. The Yew could keep a dying mortal moving so long as it was willing to be fed. His tenure as host was remembered most for the way he had burnt out so rapidly. Yew'n's presence in the hall was a warning that the Yewbound host was not always chosen. Sometimes it was simply what the world threw into the dark when it had no other place to put it. "Does it still pull?" Wryke asked the Rootkin. The Rootkin with the bowl answered out loud. "Still pull." "Less than before?" "Small, less," the Rootkin replied. Wryke nodded. The pull they spoke of was the way some interred bodies seemed to lean against their amber from within. Yew'n had pulled for years, resisting stillness long after stillness should have taken him. That too was the mark of a man who had never learned how to stop. They moved on as the hall dipped further. The amber light became brighter again, and for a time the cells they passed held bodies that did not intrude. Names remained where they belonged, in records and whispers, and that was how it was supposed to be. At the next chamber, the Rootkin paused without being told. Wryke felt it before he saw it. The amber's glow was pale and slightly greened. Within, a woman hung who Wryke knew had never been fully at rest in life and resisted rest in death. The posture was too alert, although the amber held her flawlessly. Wryke did not look at the face for long. Lisa Fenwood, the Ash Bride. Wryke could never allow her name to form fully in his mind, because the moment he did, he remembered the piercing screams of a mind refusing to become host. He remembered the severing ritual as something done once and never spoken of again, except to admit that once had been enough. Wryke briefly checked the integrity there, refusing the temptation to look for anything else. "Is it stable?" he asked. The Rootkin answered, "Bride, stable." "Move on," he said, and the Rootkin obeyed. The next section of the hall was older still, the bodies placed where space had been found when their interment was required. Here the amber's glow varied wildly. One chamber held a thin figure with his hands splayed open in a kind of final argument. Another held a broad woman whose face had been calm enough to look asleep. Wryke passed them all, but the Rootkin paused at a chamber whose amber held faint scarring, like healed cuts. They cleaned it carefully, and Wryke came back because he recognized the pattern. Inside, a woman's body was suspended slightly higher than usual, nearer to the upper flow of the saplight. Her hair, once dark, had been lightened by long exposure, and her hands were positioned palms down on her chest. The amber around her showed faint layering, thicker at the shoulders and spine, thinner around the face where it had been poured late. Cara Lowfield, the Briar Matron. During her time in the Yewdeep, she had been meticulous, tireless, and impossible to hurry. She listened longer than the Rootkin liked, and answered questions they had not meant to ask. She insisted on receiving reports directly, rather than through the usual channels, and for a time the Yew had tolerated it because nothing she altered failed. Under her bearing, the sap flows stabilized, border root collapses ceased entirely, and 3 chambers long considered unreliable returned to use. What unsettled Wryke was not what Cara had changed, but what she had noticed. She kept sending Wryke to the Hall of Bearing when there was no reason to be there, checking bodies already deemed complete. When questioned, she said only that the hall was not finished doing its work. No correction followed, because nothing she did breached any procedure. In the end, her tenure was ended by exhaustion. She asked to be laid while still coherent, before the Yew took more than she was willing to give. The request was accepted after a delay Wryke had never seen before or since. Now she was properly interred. Those who bore as host always ended, and then they were silent. Wryke did not allow himself to revisit her questions, and his thoughts were interrupted by one of the Rootkin finishing the surface check. It spoke 2 words aloud. Briar. Silent. Yes, Wryke said. Silent. He moved again, and they reached the far end, where the floor sank into the deepest part of the hall, and where the chambers were fewer. The bodies held there were older or more significant, indicated by the way the hall had been built around them. This was where the Yewdeep's important histories could be met. The chamber on the left held a woman whose posture was unlike the others. She looked as though she might stand up and walk away, were she not encased in amber. The line of her legs, the set of her hips, the position of her arms, everything in her suggested motion arrested, not motion ended. Isabel Moore, the Hollow Matron. Wryke remembered her as the first presence he ever encountered in the Yewdeep. She had been mobile, unbound by the later constraints of cradle or roots. She had walked the passage and looked at the Rootkin as both tools and companions. She had admitted Wryke when he had been no one, a displaced body from a collapsed realm, with no claim of authority and no right to stand in the Yewdeep at all. She had put him to work in what were then called the sallow paths. He had worked, and in the years that followed, he had become that day's Wryke through an accumulation of tasks done, knowledge carried, and errors prevented. The memory of her voice came to Wryke, sharp and plain. Do not build your abilities on what you cannot maintain. He did not know whether she had meant the Yew or the fragile architecture of the marchlands. At the time, he had been too exhausted to ask. Now, seeing her interred, he felt the faintest glimmer of something that might have been sadness. Isabel's body in amber was a contradiction. She had not belonged there, and yet there she was, preserved like the rest. The host had been mobile once, and different for it. The Yew had never explained why that had to change. The Rootkin cleaned the amber in front of Isabel's chamber with reverence and caution. Wryke watched them for a moment, and then forced his eyes away. This was not a place for longing, even the longing to return to a time when the doctrine had been less rigid. Wryke turned toward the final checks. There was, at the very end of the hall, a space that was not a chamber. It was a wall section where the rootwork was rougher than elsewhere, where something had once been grown and then removed. It was not an empty chamber waiting to be filled. It was a gaping absence. Wryke stopped there every time, and every time he did it, the Rootkin stopped with him, because this was an unspoken part of the routine they now recognized. He lifted the bowl of resin from the Rootkin's hands, dipped his fingers, and pressed them lightly to it. The gesture meant nothing in practical terms. It cleaned nothing, sealed nothing, and didn't strengthen the hall. It was just something he did. The Rootkin watched his fingers work, and neither spoke. Boda should have returned. The thought was an expectation embedded in the shape of the Yewdeep's practice, because the Yewbound Hosts themselves had been built around the assumption that the first would come back to complete what had been left unfinished. Wryke knew, deep down, that it was an expectation that had outlived sense. He had never known Boda. Nobody living in the Yewdeep had known Boda in a way that mattered. Boda existed as a name, an absence that made the Yewdeep feel slightly off balance and answered nothing. Yet the expectation remained, repeated every sap ceremony, carried forward as habit was carried forward, because to stop doing it would be to admit something that could not be admitted without consequences. Behind him, one of the Rootkin spoke. Boda, return. Wryke did not look back. No, he said, not yet. Perhaps never. We wait. He turned away and resumed the walk back along the hall. The return path always felt longer. The Rootkin moved with him, wiping, smoothing, ensuring nothing had changed while they were not looking. The work was meticulous, but also futile. The hall did not decay quickly, and it certainly did not need constant care to remain intact. The work existed because the Yew needed them to keep doing it. It needed the idea of vigilance to remain active. A neglected hall would not collapse, but it could become a question being asked in inconvenient quarters. Wryke paused once more at King Jevon's chamber, because his mind had returned there despite his efforts. He had seen Jevon's sigils stamped into coins in the hands of travellers who did not know the man was in the hall. He had heard the Marchlands speak of Yewon as if he were still a single monarch in spirit, whose reign had ended with honour rather than with flight. The hall told a different truth, but it did not care whether the world believed it. Too much, Wryke said, and realised he had spoken aloud. The Rootkin looked at him, waiting for direction. Nothing, Wryke added, and the Rootkin returned to their work. At Isabel's chamber, he did not stop again. He could not afford to. Her presence in the hall, her mobility remembered as something that had once been permitted, pressed too hard on the shape of his current duties. He had authority now, of a kind. He had responsibility that others did not question. If he let himself linger at Isabel, he would begin to wonder whether authority in the Yewdeep was real, or simply the accumulation of everyone else's willingness to stop asking questions. He did not want that thought in his mind, while the Thorn Mother still held the station. Her tenure was a stabilizing force. If anything could be held together by discipline alone, it would be held under her. As they neared the chamber that held Lisa Fenwood, Wryke's pace slowed again. The Rootkin's cloth slid over the amber once more, and the flawless surface remained flawless. Wryke kept his eyes on the edges. He refused to look at the woman's face. A fragment of memory rose anyway, a scream that had warped into panic, roots tightening, and Wryke authorizing the procedure that nobody wanted to countenance. He shoved the fragment back down. The hall did not demand he remember everything after all. They stood in the middle for a moment, all three of them, with the interred suspended around them in their amber and the sap lights glowing gently against the walls. The hall felt complete. It also felt like a mouth held shut. Wryke turned toward the exit. "We're done," he said. The Rootkin followed him, silently. They stepped out of the hall and into the broader flow of the Yewdeep. Wryke did not allow himself to look back. The hall did not need watching once you left it. And yet, as he walked, the sealed absence at the far end of the hall stayed with him like the ghost of a gesture he could not stop repeating. Each renewal, the Yewdeep expected Boda's return. It had not happened in Wryke's lifetime. It had not happened in any lifetime he could remember. He told himself that an expectation was not a prophecy. And then he walked on, carrying the hall's silence back to his chamber. And to the tumultuous next day.
The work is done, the checks are passed, and the silence remains, but only because everyone agrees not to ask what that silence is waiting for.